So let's dive right in. Standard disclaimer, all views expressed are mine alone. They are not that of my employer, any former employer, and organization that I'm a member of. Just keep that in mind. I am the unpopular opinion guy, so there might be a little bit of snark in my presentation. So why me? Here's a list of things. I've been doing cybersecurity for a really, really long time. So I've done quite a bit of different things, speaking at conferences, co-authoring certifications, books, teaching at Tulane University as a professor for cybersecurity. So I have a little bit of a background in the larger thing of all things cybersecurity. So with that, let's dive in. There is kind of setting the stage. The reality of assets is that it's complete chaos. When you look at the stats, IoT alone has grown 13% in the last year. And the folks that do the math and the projections are saying that it's going to grow 13% year over year, probably for the next decade. That's a massive amount of things. 70% of organizations allow employees to use their own devices. 61% of organizations allow users to extend their workforce to use personal devices for work purposes outside of a straight bring your own device capability. 18% allow customers to interact with their IT devices, and only 14% of organizations say they are not doing some kind of bring your own device adoption. That's huge. That's massively increasing your threat landscape. What it also does is create largely a lot of unmanaged devices that make it extremely hard to find these vulnerabilities. Cybersecurity, unfortunately, as a whole, tends to be a very reactive type of organization. We react to breaches, we react to attacks, but we haven't done a really great job at being proactive, leaving massive amount of gaps. So let's kind of take a look forward and how can we address this and kind of bring order to the chaos that is assets. So why is it a crisis? Why is this so important that we should do something about it? Well, unmanaged assets are absolutely hidden risk. I've got some key stats up here, and they're all roughly this. You can look at different reports and the numbers vary. I kind of took the middle of the road approach, but 90% of ransomwares are linked in some shape or form to unmanaged assets. You have time to detect that is north of 200 days for large organizations. The actual number based off of last year's report was 227 or 275 days if you had an XDR, was 304 if you didn't have an XDR. That's massive amount of time before you even discover something's in your network, and then up to another month for it to be in your network and doing those bad things before you're able to fully remediate it. You're talking half a year to almost a full year of something being in your network doing bad things before you know it's there and before you can actually fix it. We have massive amounts of impact. I preach about shadow IT, shadow AI all the time. Anyone with a credit card is now a IT department. They are creating and building assets that you may not know about. How do you actually track that? What are you doing to manage those expectations? Do you have policies in place around that? Well, if you don't, you're kind of behind the curve. So there's a cost. And ultimately, asset management is one of those things no one likes to do. I've done hundreds of presentations. I've done consulting work, lots and lots of organizations, from SMBs to Fortune 100 organizations, government agencies. And one of the questions I ask is, how confident are you in your CMDB, your configuration management database, the place where you should have all of your assets? And I generally start with, are you 100% sure everything is in there? And no one ever has raised their hand for that. I normally get some hands raised when I get, say, 80% and say, do you think 80% of your stuff is there? Do you think your most important stuff is there? But by and large, folks just know that there is very little true asset management because it's not a priority for them. It's seen as a side job. It's one of those things that you do when you have time. But ultimately, That's the worst thing you can do, because even though so Siraj says he's at 10% confidence at the moment. That tracks. I would not be shocked by that. But you have the increase of security risk. We have this idea that we're resource constrained, and that leads to a do it later mindset. You know, we have a lack of visibility into the assets, and that creates a whole level of risk, and it amplifies those risks. You know, there have been times where I have gone into an organization and go, you have this really vulnerable system. Who owns it and what does it do? And I get crickets from everyone. But it's highly vulnerable and has access to all the other things in your system. So now we have a forgotten system that's been breached, and now it can pivot into other areas of your environment because you didn't know. And if you don't know about things, you can't make decisions. So ultimately, it's a case where if I don't know, I can't make a decision on it. So you need to have valuable information tied around this. With that, we do have the approach to go from purely reactive to proactive. So I call this my path to regain control. You have to have a centralized inventory. You have to build that comprehensive assets inventory that has everything in it. And that includes all of your things that are bring your own device. How are you managing those? Are you just using pure SaaS applications? Are you using some kind of MDM? How is that being managed? And do you have policies and procedures in place on how that risk is being managed? Automate, automate, automate. The more you can automate, the easier this job becomes. Asset discovery, use the tooling, use all the things that are out there and present from pretty much a multitude of vendors to help you bring data in that makes the right decisions at the right time. You have to understand risk. If you can't understand what your risk is and what your business is, then you fundamentally run into a problem where you cannot rank vulnerabilities based on asset criticality and exposure. A device that has, I'll take two devices. One is a internal device behind 3 layers of firewalls with appropriate segmentation and access control on it that has a critical CVE on it. And then I have another device that has a, medium level CVE, but it's on my edge, web server. Which one of those is more important to my risk profile and to my company? Well, the standard logic would be the one that has the critical vulnerability deep inside your network would have more risk because it has a higher CVE score. But the reality of that is it absolutely is not. You have multiple layers of protection between that and a potential bad actor. But that medium that's sitting on the outside edge, that's where your real threat is. In fact, if you take a look at the way most threat actors come in now, they're not leveraging, high vulnerabilities or even critical vulnerabilities. They're stringing a bunch of mediums and lows that never get patched because you don't have time to do that. And then they use those to kind of leverage their way into your system. So that medium or low that you have sitting that, you haven't addressed, and you're using like the DoD model where, you patch criticals in 15 days, highs in 30, your mediums in 90, and whenever you can get to it, you try to patch your lows. That's a lot of vulnerable assets sitting out there. And that's only the things that you're already tracking and maintaining. If you don't have automated discovery, if you don't have centralized inventory, which kind of rolls into that regular maintenance. Do continuous monitoring, not one-off audits. You don't do something once a year and call it good. You need to have regular capability. So that automated discovery, you need to be running that more than, once a year period, more than once a month, depending on the size and complexity of your network, do a discovery on a segment a day, do full discovery of your network once a week on the weekend. But if you're not doing those things on a regular basis, you're just setting yourself up for failure. And unfortunately, we do that a lot because it becomes a priority of time. So kind of moving to that, common challenges. You know, how do we overcome all this chaos? So we have IoT. IoT is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Folks are going out and buying it, buying security cameras, buying all kinds of new physical security stuff. So how do you manage that? How do you take and limit those vulnerabilities related to that? Use network segmentation and device authentication. Enforce these things from a fundamental and policy level. The number of IoT devices that I have found in environments where they are purely straight out of the box, they have done nothing to secure them, is astronomical. And that's because they're just not viewed the same as other IT environments. Cloud sprawl. Well, I kind of hinted at it earlier. Anybody with a credit card is now an IT department. 15 years ago, before the real propagation of cloud as we know it, if you wanted to do something, you wanted to hook up a piece of hardware, you probably had to go through your IT department at a minimum to get a port opened, to get an IP address, to be able to get accounts put on it so they could access things. Now I can swipe a card and have a full-on environment and do everything, do all these AI learning models and pumping data in from my environment, potentially without permission. So we really need to know that what we have. Now, there are some really great cloud monitoring tools that not only tell you what you have, but how's it set up and what you need to do to fix that. Leveraging those things become critical to overcoming this obstacle. Legacy systems. I've done a lot in the manufacturing space, and you have a lot of legacy systems where they're still running things that are Windows XP. I did a evaluation of a small community water system treatment plant that's South Louisiana, and they still had a system that was running on a absolutely vanilla Windows 2000 server that has been rebooted twice ever. So there is these legacy systems, and they create issues because they don't get patched. Sometimes you're scared to patch them. Sometimes it's a case of you don't know that this legacy system's still there. It's just a computer off in the closet beeping that has some key function to your organization. I've done that kind of experiment where we see something, nobody owns it, and we pull the plug and see who screams, and all of a sudden some key function of your organization completely breaks. So you have to understand that you have these legacy systems, and how you deal with them is largely identify them, phase them out as risky dependencies, figure out what they're doing and what can be replaced with a modern sustainable solution. I think the more important one of all of these is bad policy or lack thereof for policy. How are you directing that people own assets? How are you actually managing getting assets into your CMDB? How are you managing your change management program? Do you have those things in place within your organization to make sure that you have the checks and balances to get you where you need to go? Now, it wouldn't be me talking about cybersecurity if there weren't some unpopular opinions. Asset management isn't a chore. It feels like a chore. It absolutely is time consuming, especially when you get it set up, but it is a security imperative. The ultimate task here is I cannot secure what I do not know I have. If I don't know what I have and what its configuration is, I have zero chance of having a secure environment. It's just plain simple black and white. We also like to do set it and forget it. This is not something you can set and forget. It is not patching. It's not something that you can go and press the button and just hope everything goes well. Rely on your discovery scans, rely on all of these tools. You have to monitor it. You have to put the time and energy in to make sure it's doing the things that you need it to do to get out the best thing from your organization. Ultimately, Every single asset in your organization should have a by name owner. If you don't have a by name owner who can tell you exactly what it does, why it's there, and how it supports your business, you have to do it better and get that documented. And ideally, you put that in that centralized repository of things that you own to help you better understand your risk. So, how do you win the game? If this is hide and seek and we're losing, what do we do to make ourselves better? Inventory your assets. Do it now. Ideally, you should have done it 2 years ago. You should have done it 10 years ago, but do it now and do it continuously. Don't let it be something that you do once and just hope it stays good. Invest in the tools that give you the visibility and the automation to do the things that you need it to do. Do your configuration for your endpoints, do your patching, do the monitoring, do all of that threat landscape tooling around your inventory. Again, establish the accountability of ownership. If there's somebody who owns this, give them the actual authority and the responsibility to manage that asset. If it's not being held to this right standard, hold them accountable to that. If you're not doing that, all the other things that you've done are largely a waste. Last one, make vulnerability management part of everyday operations. It's not something that you do. It is something that's part of everything that you do. If you make vulnerability management its own program that has somebody who owns that, you don't have buy-in from everyone. They're going to give you 6 excuses of why they can't do this or can't do that and can't patch this thing. Make it part of the day-to-day operations. How you run your business includes vulnerability management because it ties back to the larger picture of your organization's risk management. If you can't manage risk, you're not going to have a business for very long. Ultimately, control the chaos before it controls you. Proactive asset management reduces your risk, it saves time, and improves your security posture. It sucks, it's time consuming up front, but I promise you, over the course of the time after you get this kicked off, your environment will be more secure, stay more secure, and be more resilient as things change. Ultimately, I hope you have something that you can take away from this, that you picked up a nugget with a idea where you're going to look at what framework you're going to comply to, whether it's a CIS benchmark or a NIST or a DISA STIG or SOC 2, ISO 27001. Figure out where your gaps might be and just do that assessment. Understand where you might have a missing case of tooling. Understand the tooling that you have that you might not be using fully. You might have a tool that does vulnerability scanning, but you haven't used the configuration management portion. Deep dive into that. Contact vendors, understand what they have. There's tons of tools out there. It can be easy, but you have to put the effort in up front. So with that, thank you for having some time with me.